There's a lot of books out there about writing well. Some of them are aimed at science fiction and fantasy authors, and they generally tend to revolve around things like world building or creating magic systems or being consistent with science in one's universe. And then there are a lot of generic writing well books that tend to revolve around things like improving one's vocabulary, spelling, grammar, punctuation, that sort of thing. Today I want to talk about the best book that I've ever encountered about writing generally, and about how a lot of what it says can be applied back to how science fiction and fantasy can be written well. The book I'm talking about is called Telling Writing, and it's written by a professor named Ken McCrory, who passed away a few years ago. And it's been revised several times since its original publication. This last revision, the fourth revision, was published in 1985. So some of the advice in it, or some of the specific topical references, I should say, may be a little dated by now, but the advice itself is pretty timeless. And one of the things that Telling Writing is about is, as the title implies, it's about writing that tells. It's about writing that is expressive and communicative and specific. And one of the reasons McCrory wanted to write a textbook about that subject was because so much of the writing that he was being given in his writing courses by his students was not expressive and not communicative and not individuated. It sounded like the product of some student mass mind. And he grew very frustrated with this because he wanted his students to speak to him in their own language. But it was the hardest thing to get that unlocked, to get them talking to him in their language. So as an example of this, I want to read from the first chapter of the book, which is called The Poison Fish. And the reason it's titled that is because during his encounters with students and their bad writing, he coined a phrase for this certain kind of dead, inexpressive, generic writing that he was seeing. And he called it ingfish. And so one of the assignments that he was given by one of his students began like this. I went downtown today for the first time. When I got there, I was completely astonished by the hustle and the bustle that was going on. My first impression of the downtown area was quite impressive. And McCrory's answer to this was, beautiful ingfish. The writer said not simply that he was astonished, but completely astonished, as if the word astonished had no force of its own. The student pretended would be a truer word, to have observed hustle and bustle, and then explained in true English that the hustle and bustle was going on. He managed to work in the academic word area, and finished by saying the impression was impressive. Part of what made him so angry about this kind of writing was that it wasn't confined exclusively to bad student writing. It was leaking out and infecting everything. One of the textbooks that he was working with at one point began with what he described as an ingfish sentence. And the sentence is, if you are a student who desires assistance in order to write effectively and fluently, then this textbook is written for you. And his comment is, a tongue never spoken outside the walls of the classroom, that is. And he has a number of other examples in this vein, and every time one of them came up, I kept saying to myself, man, this sounds to my ears like nothing less than the kind of generic text that you'd get out of ChatGPT or one of the other, large language models that are currently in vogue. Even though the book itself was originally written in the 1960s and was last updated in the 1980s, dead language has been with us forever. So we've got a perpetual fight against it. The fight against it never stops. The rest of the book, it's organized into about, 22 chapters, each of which covers a different slice of this topic about how to write more expressively. And it isn't just about things like choice of vocabulary. His mission is a little more general than that. Like, for instance, one of the first things he talks about is the practice. And I want to emphasize that word, the practice of writing freely, of doing things like keeping a journal, of doing things like learning how to de-censor the voice that you use on the page, and how to do things like write freely both with and without focus, because both of those are necessary. You write freely without focus at first just to get words out, just to get the hydrant opened up. And then you figure out your focus from that, and you write that much more specifically and precisely. And these two things feed into each other. You use one to support the other and vice versa. And he also talks about how to do things like take observations from our daily lives and make those into the substance of our work. And he has a couple of different approaches to this. One of them is called fabulous realities, where he encourages you to notice things and to report back on them in as unself-censored a way as possible. And he also talks about another thing that really struck me personally, which is the idea of your subject choosing you. This is chapter 17, and there's quite a bit of detail in there about this concept. That's not the way that we would normally phrase this sort of thing, and that's what intrigued me, because normally we say to ourselves, okay, I'm going to find a subject to write about, instead of saying, what subjects have intruded, so to speak, or chosen my life to express themselves through. So it's a little counterintuitive, and it makes it that much more interesting to unpack and think about. So the book has a lot of examples, many from his own students, some from writing that he selected at large that he thought was representative of the ideas that he wanted to communicate. So it also makes for a good reader. And the whole thing is only maybe about 280-something pages, 290 pages, including the index. So you don't have to sit down and read the whole thing front to back, although theoretically you could do that in a couple of days. My approach to it was originally just to keep it on this shelf. You can't see it from here. There's a shelf directly over my desk where I keep what I call the forever books. These are the books that I'm always reaching for and always pulling down. And I suspect in future videos I may show you some of this stuff and talk about it in more detail. This goes on the forever shelf, because every time I pull it down and just open it at random, there's something wonderful in there to think about. He has a whole section in here about how to respond to other people's writing, for instance. And that's a really difficult art to hone. That may be an even harder art to hone than writing itself. Learning how to respond effectively to what other people are saying and to give constructive criticism instead of simply responding out of one's prejudices. So you probably have a good idea by now of why I treasure this book as much as I do, because it has taught me more really useful things about how to make my writing better than almost any other book I've ever encountered. And that also goes back into writing better science fiction and fantasy, because for one thing, any form of fiction tends to thrive on specific details. The more specific and individuated those details, the more they feel like something that was lived or something that was encountered instead of something that was just scraped from another source, the more they're going to come alive for the reader too. And so the techniques that McRory gives you for how to do that seem like naturals for writing better SF and fantasy too. They will teach you to think about how the things that are in your life can be put into a work of fiction in a way that isn't just stenographic, in a way where you're not just copying the details, but you're seeing how the details inspire you on another level. Another thing that he focuses on, which again I think is really important for SF and fantasy, is about finding an individuated voice, finding a way to talk about your material that is yours and that is not simply something that you saw somewhere else. It's about finding your own specific words for things, about finding your own specific outlook on things. And in SF and fantasy, I think that's really important, because it's too easy to read a lot of what other people do and then simply work in their mode or in their model and then call it a day. I'm not saying that if somebody does that, they are automatically a bad writer. I'm saying that if they stay at that level and they don't push themselves, if they don't try to find more of what they themselves have to say that nobody else can say, then their work is going to be similarly constrained. They're going to be writing stuff that will only strain so much at the leash of imagination, as it were. The other thing I really like about this book, and again, this relates back to SF and F, is how he talks about cultivating a sense of wonder through one's observation, in the sense that a lot of the most wonderful things that we can put into a science fiction and fantasy story may not necessarily be things that we made up. They may be things that we observed in our lives and infused into the substance of our story. There was one exercise where he gave his students in recognizing what he called fabulous reality, where you go out and you look for something and you report back on it that really strikes you. And one of his students came back with what is probably one of the funniest quotes in the whole book. And McRory prefaces this by saying, "Note how the facts in this fabulous reality do all the telling by themselves." And the quote goes like this: "A pimply-faced, dirty, barefooted, greasy, string-haired girl smoking a cigarette and eating a peanut butter and jelly sandwich, riding a crowded elevator at the University of Michigan, while reading How to Win Friends and Influence People." I hate using phrases like "you can't make that up," but, There are some things that you're going to have to make up, and there are some things you're going to feel obliged to make up, and then there are some things that you're going to fall back on the world around you to draw from because it's just so rich. And that's one of the things McCrory keeps coming back to in this book, is how to draw on what's around you, how to pay attention to it, how to give it the words that it deserves to have. And I think those are skills science fiction and fantasy authors in particular really should be cultivating. So once again, the book is called Telling Writing, 4th edition by Ken McCrory. It is available on Amazon. I have a link down in the description to where you can get it, and I can't recommend it enough. In the future, I'll be looking at other books in this vein, which are for a general writing audience, but which I think have wonderful application to how SF and fantasy can be written better. So long for now.